The city was a patchwork of lights against the velvety darkness of night. Honking cars and distant sirens painted an almost rhythmic chaos. But to Dr. Aaron Clark, it was another regular evening at St. Augustine's Medical Center. He was a man accustomed to pressure, a surgeon who had stitched lives back together in moments of desperation. Tonight, however, felt different. Aaron had just finished a grueling shift when the call came in. A critical patient needed immediate transport. The paramedics couldn't handle it alone. Time wasn't just of the essence, it was the difference between life and death. He didn't hesitate. Slipping into his white coat, Aaron dashed out to the ambulance bay, his heart pounding with urgency. Inside the ambulance, the patient, a man in his late 60s, lay unconscious. His breathing shallow, his face was pale, sweat slicking his forehead. Aaron didn't know who he was yet, only that the man was important enough to warrant a police escort. That detail barely registered. To Aaron, every patient deserved the same intensity of care, whether they were a senator or a janitor. Vitals dropping, the paramedic murmured, eyes darting between monitors. Aaron placed a hand on the man's shoulder, as if his steady presence alone could anchor the man to life. "We'll get him there," he said firmly. "We don't stop." The ambulance weaved through traffic, its sirens slicing through the air like a desperate plea. They had less than 15 minutes to reach the hospital. Aaron focused on stabilizing the patient's condition, instructing the paramedic on administering medication to keep the blood pressure steady. Suddenly, the ambulance jolted to a stop. Aaron stumbled, catching himself against the rail. Outside, flashing blue and red lights illuminated the night. A police cruiser had pulled directly in front of them, blocking their path. "What the hell?" the driver started. Throwing open the door, Aaron followed, stepping onto the pavement. The officer approached, his boots crunching against the asphalt. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried an air of unquestioned authority. His name tag read Willman. "What's going on here?" Aaron asked, his voice calm but firm. "This is an emergency. We need to get through." Willman's eyes narrowed as he looked Aaron up and down. "License and credentials," he demanded, ignoring the blaring siren and the urgency of the moment. Aaron frowned. "I'm Dr. Clark, from St. Augustine's. I'm the attending physician on this ambulance. There's no time for this. We're carrying a critical patient." Willman held up a hand to silence him. "Step aside, doctor. I'll decide what's critical." The exchange escalated quickly. Aaron's protests were met with stone-faced indifference, and Willman's tone grew sharper with every word. "You don't look like a doctor to me," Willman muttered, almost under his breath. The words hit Aaron like a slap, but he forced himself to stay calm. He'd dealt with microaggressions before, colleagues doubting his credentials, patients mistaking him for a nurse, but this was different. This was life-threatening. "Listen," Aaron said, struggling to keep his voice even. "We're wasting time. If this patient doesn't get to the hospital soon, he will die." Willman smirked, folding his arms. "Then you'd better hope your paperwork is in order." Inside the ambulance, the patient's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The paramedic stuck her head out the window, shouting, "He's crashing. We have to move." Aaron took a step forward, his voice rising in desperation. "Officer, do you want a death on your hands? Let us through." Willman's expression darkened. "Don't raise your voice at me," he snapped. Without warning, he grabbed Aaron by the arm. Aaron instinctively pulled back, trying to free himself, but the move seemed to ignite Willman's simmering anger. The officer shoved Aaron against the side of the ambulance, pinning him in place. The force knocked the breath out of him, but Aaron refused to let pain cloud his resolve. "You're assaulting a physician in the middle of an emergency," Aaron said through gritted teeth. "Do you understand what you're doing?" Willman ignored him, tightening his grip. Behind them, the paramedic screamed, "We're losing him. Please." The world seemed to freeze in that moment. Aaron's mind raced. Was this how it ended? Not in the operating room. Not fighting for someone's life. But being crushed under the weight of another man's hatred? Finally? The commotion drew a crowd. Bystanders began filming with their phones, their murmurs rising into a chorus of outrage. Willman glanced at them, his confidence faltering for the first time. It was then that someone from the crowd yelled, "Do you even know who's in that ambulance? That's Senator Holt." The name cut through the chaos like a blade. For a split second, Willman froze, his grip on Aaron slackening. Aaron didn't waste the opportunity. "If he dies," he said, his voice shaking with both exhaustion and fury, His blood is on your hands. Move the damn car. Willman hesitated, glancing at the ambulance, then back at Aaron. The weight of the situation finally seemed to sink in. With a scowl, he stepped aside. The ambulance roared to life. Speeding away, Aaron climbed back inside, ignoring the searing pain in his ribs. The patient's vitals were barely holding, but Aaron refused to let the injustice of what had just happened cloud his focus. He barked orders, hands moving with practiced precision, doing everything he could to keep the man alive by the time they reached the hospital. The senator was barely clinging to life. Aaron worked tirelessly alongside the team, pushing his own injuries to the back of his mind. Every second felt like a lifetime. Finally, they stabilized him, but the damage had been done. The senator's condition was critical, and whether he'd survive the night was uncertain. Aaron slumped into a chair, exhaustion overtaking him. The weight of what had happened pressed down on his chest like a physical force. As he sat there, bruised and battered, one thought consumed him. This isn't just about me. This is about every life that prejudice and ignorance endanger. The night was alive with urgency. The sharp wail of distant sirens echoed through the city, blending with the hum of late-night traffic. For Dr. Aaron Clark, the evening began like many others, a steady stream of emergencies, each demanding his undivided attention. But as he stepped out of the operating room, exhaustion weighing heavily on his shoulders, his pager buzzed insistently. "Dr. Clark, we need you in the ambulance bay. Now." The urgency in the dispatcher's voice was unmistakable. Aaron didn't waste time with questions. Within moments, he was running through the hospital corridors, the fluorescent lights flickering above him. His mind raced as he reached the ambulance. The paramedic briefed him quickly. A patient in critical condition, en route to St. Augustine's. But they needed immediate stabilization during transit. Aaron climbed into the vehicle, assessing the situation. The man on the stretcher was pale. His breathing labored, and the steady beep of the heart monitor was erratic. The paramedic handed him a chart, but Aaron barely glanced at it. The details were secondary to what was in front of him, a man fighting for his life. "Administer epinephrine," Aaron instructed calmly. His hands worked with precision, checking the IV line and ensuring oxygen flow. The patient groaned softly, his body barely responsive. "You're going to make it," Aaron murmured, more to himself than to the unconscious man. "Just hold on." The ambulance tore through the city streets, the siren a piercing cry for urgency. Inside, the paramedic relayed updates on the patient's condition. Blood pressure was dropping, time was running out. Aaron stayed focused, adjusting medications and watching for signs of improvement. But just as the ambulance rounded a corner, the vehicle screeched to an abrupt halt, throwing Aaron off balance. He grabbed the side rail to steady himself. "What's going on?" Aaron demanded, stepping toward the driver's compartment. "Police," the driver muttered, his tone laced with disbelief. "They've stopped us." Aaron pushed open the rear door and stepped out, his breath visible in the cold night air. Parked in front of the ambulance was a police cruiser, its lights flashing. The officer who stepped out was imposing, broad-shouldered, with a scowl etched into his face. His badge gleamed under the streetlights. "What's the problem, officer?" Aaron asked, his voice firm but respectful. "We're in the middle of a medical emergency." The officer's name tag read Willman, and the look in his eyes was far from cooperative. "License and credentials," he barked. Aaron blinked in disbelief. "I'm Dr. Aaron Clark. I'm a physician at St. Augustine's. We're transporting a critical patient who needs immediate medical attention." "Papers," Willman repeated, his tone colder. The driver stepped forward. "Officer, we don't have time for this." "The patient," Willman held up a hand. "This is my scene now," he snapped. "Nobody moves until I say so." Aaron's pulse quickened. He could feel the seconds slipping away, each one a blow to the patient's chances of survival. He stepped closer, trying to maintain his composure. "Officer Willman," he said evenly, "this isn't about me or you. There's a man in that ambulance who is dying. If you delay us any further, his death will be on your hands." Willman's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening me?" Aaron felt a surge of frustration but kept his tone controlled. "No, I'm appealing to your sense of responsibility. This is a medical emergency." Willman's gaze lingered on Aaron's face, his expression hardening. "You don't get to tell me what's an emergency. Now step back before I detain you." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Aaron couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could anyone be so blind to the gravity of the situation? The paramedic leaned out of the ambulance, her voice shaking. Doctor, the patient's crashing. Aaron's heart raced. Officer, I'm begging you, let us go. If this man dies, step back, Willman barked, his hand hovering near his holster. The crowd that had begun to gather around the scene shifted uncomfortably, murmuring among themselves. Some had started filming with their phones, capturing every tense moment. Aaron's voice rose, desperation cutting through his usual calm. This is a matter of life and death. Let me do my job. Willman's face twisted into a sneer. Your job, huh? What kind of doctor gets this worked up? You think you're special? The words were laced with condescension, but Aaron had no time for pride. Please, he said, his voice breaking. Please. But instead of stepping aside, Willman reached out and grabbed Aaron by the arm, shoving him against the side of the ambulance. The force of the impact knocked the wind out of him, and pain radiated through his chest. Get your hands off him, someone in the crowd yelled. Others began shouting, the scene devolving into chaos inside the ambulance. The patient's heart monitor emitted a shrill, continuous beep. The paramedic screamed, "We're losing him." Aaron, his head spinning from the impact, tried to push past Willman. If he dies, his blood is on your hands, he shouted. It was then that a voice from the crowd cut through the noise. Do you even know who's in that ambulance? A man shouted, his phone aimed at Willman. That's Senator Holt. The name sent a ripple through the onlookers. Aaron froze for a moment, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Senator Gerald Holt, a man whose influence reached far beyond city limits, was the patient fighting for his life. Willman's grip slackened, and for the first time, hesitation flickered in his eyes. But Aaron didn't wait for him to react. Shoving past the officer, he climbed back into the ambulance. Drive, he barked at the driver. Now, the ambulance roared to life, tearing down the street toward the hospital. Aaron focused entirely on the patient, his hands moving with practiced precision. His ribs ached, and his vision blurred, but he refused to stop. Stay with me, he whispered to the unconscious man. You're not leaving tonight, not on my watch. By the time they reached St. Augustine's, Aaron was running on pure adrenaline. The team swarmed the ambulance as he jumped out, relaying the patient's condition. Critical but salvageable, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. He watched as they wheeled the senator into the operating room, the doors swinging shut behind them. Only then did Aaron allow himself to collapse onto a nearby bench. His chest throbbed where Willman had slammed him against the ambulance, and his hands trembled from the adrenaline crash. Outside, the crowd from earlier had followed the ambulance to the hospital. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras flashing as they shouted questions. Aaron ignored them, his mind replaying the night's events. This wasn't over. The patient might survive, but what about the larger issue? How many lives had been endangered by prejudice masquerading as authority? How many more would suffer before change came? Aaron closed his eyes, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just about tonight. It was about something far bigger than him. The operating room was eerily silent, save for the rhythmic beeping of machines and the low murmur of voices. Dr. Aaron Clark stood beside the unconscious senator, his focus unshaken despite the throbbing pain in his ribs. The team worked seamlessly, yet the stakes loomed over them like a storm cloud. Vitals are stabilizing, but we're not out of the woods, a nurse said, glancing at Aaron for confirmation. Aaron nodded, his voice steady. Keep him on the dopamine drip. Monitor intracranial pressure every 5 minutes. For hours, Aaron remained in the operating room, refusing to leave until Senator Holt was stable. By the time he emerged, dawn had painted the horizon with streaks of orange and pink. Exhausted but resolute, Aaron leaned against the wall outside the ICU, watching as the senator was wheeled into a private room. His mind replayed the events of the night, each moment sharpening his resolve. The hospital's lobby was chaotic. News crews had gathered outside, their cameras trained on the entrance. Inside, whispers filled the air as staff and visitors alike speculated about the incident. Aaron's phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was his supervisor, Dr. Elena Price, the hospital's chief of staff. She had a commanding presence, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun. Aaron, she began, her voice clipped. I need you in my office. Now. Aaron sighed, rubbing his temple. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. In the office, Dr. Price wasted no time. Do you understand the gravity of this situation? The media is camped outside, asking for statements. They're calling it a racial profiling incident. And you're at the center of it. Aaron met her gaze, his exhaustion replaced by quiet defiance. It's not just profiling, Elena. It was obstruction. That officer delayed us long enough to put a life in danger. Dr. Price nodded, her expression softening. I understand, but this is bigger than you or me. The hospital's reputation is on the line. We need to tread carefully. Aaron clenched his fists. So, what are you saying? That I should keep quiet? I'm saying that we need to handle this strategically. If this escalates, it could derail your career. No matter how unjust it is. Aaron's jaw tightened. He didn't respond, but the weight of her words settled heavily on him. Within hours, the story broke on every major news outlet. The headlines were damning. Racial bias delays emergency care for senator, and doctor detained while saving a life. Social media exploded with outrage. Hashtags like #justice for Dr. Clark and #accountability for Willman trended globally. People shared their own experiences of racial discrimination, turning the incident into a rallying cry. For Aaron, the attention was overwhelming. Strangers flooded his inbox with messages of support, while others hurled insults and accused him of playing the race card. Despite the noise, Aaron stayed silent, focusing on his work and the senator's recovery. Meanwhile, Officer Willman found himself in the eye of a storm. Videos of the incident, captured by bystanders, circulated widely. His actions were dissected on news programs, late-night talk shows, and social media. An internal investigation was launched by the police department. It wasn't long before Willman's history of misconduct came to light, a pattern of complaints alleging excessive force and racially charged behavior. The department's spokesperson attempted to downplay the revelations, but the public wasn't buying it. Activists staged protests outside the precinct, demanding Willman's suspension. Willman, once untouchable, now faced mounting pressure. The media hounded him, his colleagues distanced themselves, and his superiors began to view him as a liability. 2 days after the surgery, Senator Gerald Holt opened his eyes. The room was dimly lit, a nurse adjusting his IV drip. He looked around, disoriented, before his gaze settled on Aaron, who had been sitting vigil by his bedside. You, the senator rasped. You're the doctor? Aaron leaned forward. Yes, Senator Holt, I'm Dr. Clark. You're in St. Augustine's Medical Center. You had a critical episode, but you're stable now. Holt nodded weakly, his expression thoughtful. I remember, the ambulance. There was an officer? Aaron hesitated. Yes, there was a delay, but you're here now, and that's what matters. The senator's eyes darkened. Delay? He paused, as if piecing together fragments of memory. He wouldn't let you through. Would he? Aaron didn't respond immediately, but the silence spoke volumes. Holt's hand trembled as he reached for Aaron's. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For not giving up on me. Aaron felt a lump rise in his throat. It's my job, Senator. Holt's grip tightened. No, it's more than that. In the days that followed, Holt's recovery progressed steadily, but the senator wasn't content to rest. From his hospital bed, he began making calls, his voice steady and commanding despite his weakened state. Aaron didn't pry. But it was clear Holt was gathering information about the incident, the officer, and the broader implications. When Aaron visited, Holt often asked probing questions about systemic issues in healthcare and law enforcement. You've dealt with this before, haven't you? Holt asked one evening. Aaron hesitated. I've faced challenges. Yes, but this was different. It wasn't just about me. It was about a system that allows prejudice to interfere with life-saving care. Holt nodded, his expression grim. It's unacceptable, and it ends now. As Holt regained his strength, he began leveraging his political influence. He reached out to allies in the media, civil rights organizations, and even law enforcement. His team released a statement condemning the actions of Officer Willman and calling for accountability. The statement was a bombshell. It not only demanded justice for Aaron but also proposed sweeping reforms to address systemic racism and abuse of power in law enforcement. Aaron watched the news coverage with a mix of gratitude and apprehension. He hadn't sought the spotlight, but he couldn't deny the importance of what was happening. One evening, as he walked into Holt's room, the senator greeted him with a rare smile. You've sparked something bigger than either of us. Doctor. Aaron shook his head. I just did my job. Holt's gaze was unwavering. And in doing so, you've reminded people what's at stake. The fluorescent lights of the ICU flickered softly as Dr. Aaron Clark stood by the window, staring into the city skyline. The senator's condition was stable for now, but the weight of the night still pressed on his chest. His ribs ached from the officer's assault, and the image of Senator Holt barely clinging to life haunted him. Aaron couldn't sleep. His mind was restless, replaying the moments where every second had mattered. A deep sense of anger simmered within him, not just at Officer Willman, but at the system that allowed someone like him to wield unchecked power. In the quiet hours before dawn, Aaron checked on the senator, ensuring his vitals remained steady. He knew this wasn't just about medical recovery. It was about survival in a different sense, for himself, for the senator, and for everyone who had faced the kind of injustice he had witnessed. By morning, the hospital lobby was unrecognizable. Reporters crowded the entrance, cameras flashing as hospital staff tried to maintain order. Aaron's face was plastered across television screens. Doctor detained while saving senator's life. The narrative had taken on a life of its own, and social media was ablaze with hashtags like #StandWithDrClark and #EndRacialBias. Aaron tried to tune it out, focusing on his rounds, but the whispers followed him everywhere. Nurses exchanged worried glances. Fellow doctors patted him on the back, offering words of encouragement. Yet, amidst the support, there was an undercurrent of tension. In a meeting with the hospital board, Dr. Elena Price, the chief of staff, addressed the situation. This is a PR nightmare. One board member grumbled, we need to release a statement distancing ourselves from the incident. Aaron's patience snapped. Distancing? I was doing my job. What happened isn't just my fight. It's a fight for every patient who deserves care without prejudice obstructing it. Dr. Price raised a hand to quiet the room. Aaron's right. This isn't just about one incident. We have a responsibility to stand for what's right. Her words carried weight, but Aaron could see the hesitation in the room. For some, the hospital's image was more important than the truth outside the hospital. The incident had ignited a firestorm. Videos of Officer Willman's actions circulated on every platform, sparking debates that polarized the public. Civil rights groups rallied behind Aaron, organizing marches and demanding accountability. Protesters gathered outside the police precinct, holding signs that read, "Doctors save lives, racism kills," and "Justice for Dr. Clark." However, the backlash wasn't universal. Conservative commentators accused Aaron of exaggerating the incident for attention. Some questioned his credentials, while others labeled him a troublemaker. Aaron avoided the media frenzy, but the messages poured in regardless. Strangers reached out with stories of their own experiences with systemic injustice. One email caught his attention, a mother thanking him for his courage, saying it gave her hope for her son, a young black medical student. Aaron felt the weight of their words. He hadn't sought to become a symbol, but he couldn't ignore the voices now looking to him for inspiration. For Officer Willman, the tide had turned. The video evidence was damning, and public opinion was unforgiving. News outlets began digging into his history, uncovering a pattern of complaints that had been quietly dismissed by his department. Officer Willman, a history of controversy, read one headline. Former colleagues came forward anonymously, describing him as volatile and discriminatory. Internal Affairs announced a full investigation, suspending Willman pending its outcome. At home, Willman found himself isolated. His wife refused to answer reporters' questions. His neighbors avoided him. Even his fellow officers began distancing themselves. Late one night, as the weight of the backlash bore down on him, Willman stared at the headlines and muttered bitterly, "They're out to ruin me." But deep down, he couldn't shake the growing realization that he was facing the consequences of years of unchecked behavior. 2 days after surgery, Senator Holt awoke to a quiet hospital room. His eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the dim light. The nurse by his side quickly called for Aaron. Aaron entered, his heart pounding. "Senator Holt," he said softly, "you're awake." The senator's gaze sharpened, his voice hoarse. "Dr. Clark, right?" Aaron nodded, pulling up a chair. "Yes, sir, you're recovering well, but we need to keep monitoring your condition." Holt studied Aaron for a long moment. "You were on the ambulance?" "I remember flashes. An officer stopped us?" Aaron hesitated. There was a delay. But you're safe now. Holt's jaw tightened. A delay? What kind of officer blocks an ambulance? Tell me the truth. Aaron explained, choosing his words carefully. He described Willman's obstruction, the physical altercation, and the desperate fight to save Holt's life despite the odds. By the time Aaron finished, the senator's face was pale, not from his condition, but from fury. That man endangered my life. For what? His ego? It wasn't just ego. Aaron replied quietly. It was bias. Holt closed his eyes, exhaling sharply. This won't stand, despite his weakened state. Senator Holt began making calls. His staff visited him in the hospital, relaying updates on the media coverage and public outcry. I want a statement drafted. Holt instructed his chief of staff. We're not just addressing what happened to me, we're addressing what allowed it to happen. The statement was a bombshell. Holt condemned systemic racism in law enforcement and called for sweeping reforms. He demanded accountability for Officer Willman and pledged to introduce legislation to prevent similar incidents in the future. Aaron watched the senator's efforts with a mix of awe and gratitude. Holt's influence was a force to be reckoned with, and he wielded it with precision. But Aaron also knew the fight wouldn't be easy. Holt's political opponents quickly criticized him, accusing him of exploiting the incident for political gain. Holt shrugged off the criticism. Let them talk, he told Aaron. This isn't about politics, it's about justice. While the public rallied around Aaron, he grappled with his own emotions. The incident had forced him into the spotlight, a place he had never wanted to be. He struggled with the weight of being a symbol for a movement he hadn't chosen. One evening, he visited the hospital chapel, seeking solace. The room was quiet, the stained glass windows casting colorful shadows on the floor. As he sat in silence, the door creaked open. It was Dr. Elena Price. I thought I'd find you here, she said, sitting beside him. How are you holding up? Aaron sighed. I'm tired, Elena. Tired of fighting battles I shouldn't have to fight. Dr. Price placed a hand on his shoulder. I know, but what you did saved a life, not just Senator Holt's, but the lives of everyone who will benefit from the changes he's fighting for. Aaron nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time since the incident, he felt a glimmer of hope. As the protests grew, Aaron began receiving invitations to speak at rallies. Though hesitant at first, he realized the importance of using his voice to amplify the message. At one rally, standing before a crowd of thousands, Aaron shared his story. He spoke not just of the incident but of the broader issues it represented: systemic inequality, the dehumanization of marginalized communities, and the need for accountability. His words resonated deeply, igniting a collective resolve among those who listened. I'm not here because I wanted to be, Aaron concluded. I'm here because I have to be. We all do. Change isn't something we wait for, it's something we fight for. The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising as the days stretched on. Dr. Aaron Clark began to feel the crushing weight of his newfound visibility. He had dedicated his life to saving others, not to becoming the face of a movement. Every time he stepped outside, the cameras were waiting, their lenses following his every move. A journalist caught him just as he left the hospital after another long shift. Dr. Clark, what do you have to say to the people who call you a hero? Aaron paused, exhausted. He rubbed his temples before answering. I'm not a hero. I'm a doctor. I was doing my job. The fact that my job was obstructed, that's the real story here. But even as he spoke, Aaron could feel the narrative slipping out of his control. To some, he was a beacon of hope. To others, he was a lightning rod for controversy. He began to question whether he had the strength to carry this burden for Officer Derek Willman. The fallout was personal, public, and inescapable. The investigation by Internal Affairs uncovered a damning pattern of misconduct. Complaints from previous years, once dismissed as misunderstandings, painted a picture of an officer who had abused his authority repeatedly. The media uncovered more. Videos surfaced of Willman berating citizens during traffic stops, complaints of excessive force, discriminatory comments made to colleagues. Willman tried to fight back, giving an interview to a sympathetic news outlet. This is a witch hunt, he claimed. I was just doing my job, enforcing the law. If that doctor had cooperated from the start, none of this would have happened. The public backlash was swift and unforgiving. The video clips of Willman's actions that night left little room for sympathy. Social media lit up with outrage, dismantling his claims with hashtags like #WomanExposed and #abuse of badge inside the hospital. Senator Holt's recovery brought clarity and determination. As he regained strength, his focus turned from healing to action. Each day, his room was visited by aides, lawyers, and civil rights leaders. One afternoon, Aaron found himself summoned to the senator's bedside. Holt was sitting upright now, his voice firmer but his eyes still tired. "Dr. Clark," Holt began, his tone measured, "I owe you more than my life. I owe you the truth." Aaron frowned, unsure of what the senator meant. Holt gestured toward the room's quiet corner, where a staffer had placed a laptop. News footage played silently, showing clips of Aaron being detained by Willman, juxtaposed with footage of Holt's stretcher being wheeled into the hospital. "They've made you the center of this storm," Holt said, "but I know that's not what you wanted." Aaron crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. "I wanted to save your life. That's it. The rest of this, I didn't ask for it." Holt nodded. "I understand, but this storm isn't going to pass. If we let it die down, the system that allowed Willman to act the way he did will stay exactly the same. And the next time, someone might not make it to the hospital." Aaron hesitated. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Holt replied, his voice like steel, "that we have to act together." Holt's team moved quickly. They organized a press conference, where the senator appeared for the first time since the incident. Flanked by Aaron and civil rights leaders, Holt addressed the nation. "What happened to me wasn't just a failure of one man," Holt began, his voice calm but firm. "It was a failure of a system that tolerates prejudice and abuse of power." He paused, letting the words settle over the crowd. Cameras clicked furiously. "Dr. Clark saved my life that night. But before he could, he was treated like a criminal. If a man of his caliber, a doctor, a lifesaver, can be treated that way, what hope do the rest of us have?" Aaron stood silently beside the senator, his heart pounding. Holt's words carried the weight of a movement, and the responsibility was overwhelming. After the conference, Holt turned to Aaron. "This is only the beginning. Are you ready?" Aaron's voice was quiet but resolute. "I don't think I'll ever be ready. But I'll do what needs to be done." The momentum built quickly. Protests swelled across the country, fueled by Holt's speech and Aaron's quiet resilience. The slogan, "Not another second," became a rallying cry, symbolizing the seconds of delay that nearly cost Holt his life, and the countless lives lost to systemic bias. At a town hall in Aaron's city, hundreds gathered to share their stories. Parents spoke of children profiled by police. Teachers described watching their students lose faith in the system. Medical professionals recounted how bias affected the care they could provide. Aaron was invited to speak last. Standing before the crowd, he took a deep breath. "I never wanted to be here," he began. "I never wanted to be the face of anything. I just wanted to save lives. But what happened to me isn't unique. It's part of a larger pattern, a pattern that says some lives are worth less than others. We can't accept that, not anymore." The room erupted into applause. And for the first time, Aaron felt a flicker of hope, not for himself, but for the change that seemed within reach while Aaron and Holt gained momentum. Willman fought to regain control of his narrative. He filed a lawsuit against the city, claiming he had been unfairly targeted and defamed. His supporters framed him as a scapegoat for larger systemic issues. Why blame one officer? A pundit argued on a right-wing news channel, when the system itself is broken. But the public wasn't swayed. Willman's defiance only deepened the outrage. Activists called for his badge, his pension, and even jail time. The walls were closing in, and Willman knew it. Late one night, he received a call from his lawyer. "You're going to lose everything," the lawyer said bluntly, "unless you cut a deal." Willman hung up without responding, but the cracks in his facade were beginning to show amid the chaos. Aaron found solace in small, unexpected places. A patient's family brought him flowers, thanking him for his courage. A young boy approached him outside the hospital, holding a crumpled drawing of Aaron in a white coat, a superhero cape billowing behind him. Aaron knelt to the boy's level. "What's your name?" he asked. "Marcus," the boy said shyly. "I want to be a doctor like you." Aaron's throat tightened. He ruffled Marcus's hair gently. "You can do anything you want, Marcus. Just don't give up." In that moment, Aaron realized that his fight wasn't just about one incident. It was about paving the way for others, like Marcus, to live in a world where they wouldn't have to fight the same battles. The second part concludes with Aaron and Holt standing together on the steps of City Hall, addressing a crowd that stretched as far as the eye could see. Holt announced the introduction of a new bill, the Equal Protection and Accountability Act, designed to overhaul the way law enforcement and emergency services interacted. "This isn't just about one life," Holt declared. "It's about all of us. And it's about the future we owe to the next generation." As the crowd erupted into cheers, Aaron looked out over the sea of faces. The road ahead was long and uncertain. But for the first time, he felt ready to walk it. Senator Gerald Holt's recovery was slow but steady. His physical strength returned in small increments. But his mind worked tirelessly, plotting the steps needed to turn this personal ordeal into systemic reform. He knew the incident wasn't just a fluke of one bad officer. It was a symptom of a disease deeply embedded in the nation's fabric. One afternoon, his chief of staff visited him in the hospital. "Sir," she began, handing him a file, "the bill draft is ready. We've also received a formal invitation for you and Dr. Clark to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee." Holt leaned back in his chair, scanning the documents. His sharp eyes caught every detail, every loophole. "This isn't strong enough," he muttered, marking a section with his pen. "This isn't just about reforming procedures. We need enforceable consequences." His staffer hesitated. "That might make it harder to pass." Holt's gaze hardened. "Then let them fight me. I'll win." Later, he called Aaron to his hospital room. "Doctor, this fight is bigger than both of us now. But I need your help. Testify with me. Share what you experienced that night." Aaron hesitated, his hands in his coat pockets. "I'm a doctor, not a politician. I don't know if I'm the right person for this." "You're exactly the right person," Holt replied. "People need to hear it from someone who lived it. They need to see the human cost of this system." Aaron finally nodded. "If it means preventing this from happening to someone else, I'll do it." Officer Willman's situation worsened as new allegations surfaced. Former colleagues stepped forward, recounting his aggressive behavior and racially biased remarks during their years on the force. One particularly damning incident involved a traffic stop where Willman detained a young black woman for over an hour without cause. She was now suing the department, her lawyer citing a pattern of abuse that echoed Aaron's ordeal. Internal affairs escalated their investigation, and whispers of a criminal indictment grew louder. Willman's lawyer publicly maintained his innocence, but behind closed doors, they argued over strategies to salvage his reputation. "You need to apologize," the lawyer urged during a late-night meeting. "Admit to some mistakes. Show remorse." "Never," Willman snapped. "I did my job. I'm not groveling for anyone." The lawyer shook his head. "You're not just losing your career, Derek, you're losing your freedom." But Willman refused to yield. Convinced he could outlast the storm, his arrogance, once his shield, was now becoming his undoing in the days leading up to the Senate hearing. Aaron found himself grappling with doubt. His decision to testify had drawn both praise and criticism. Supporters flooded his inbox with messages of encouragement, but detractors called him a liar, accusing him of tarnishing law enforcement for personal gain. One evening, as he prepared his statement for the hearing, his phone buzzed. It was his mother. "Aaron," she said softly, her voice steady, "I'm proud of you. Your father would be too." Aaron swallowed hard. His father had been a civil rights activist, a man who had marched for equality but died far too young. Growing up, Aaron had heard stories of his father's courage, but he never imagined he'd be walking a similar path. "Do you think I'm doing the right thing?" Aaron asked. "I think you're doing what you have to," she replied. "Sometimes the right thing isn't easy, but it's worth it." Her words stayed with him long after the call ended, grounding him as he prepared for the fight ahead. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing was a spectacle. Cameras lined the walls, reporters packed the gallery, and protesters rallied outside. Inside, the air buzzed with tension as Aaron and Senator Holt took their seats at the witness table. Holt spoke first, his voice commanding as he outlined the need for systemic reform. He described his own experience that night but focused on the broader implications, citing data on racial disparities in law enforcement. When Aaron took the microphone, the room fell silent. He recounted the events with precision, his voice steady but filled with quiet intensity. "I've dedicated my life to saving others," he said. "That night, My ability to do so was obstructed, not because of a lack of training or resources, but because of bias. Bias that nearly cost a man his life. The committee members listened intently. Some nodded in agreement, while others scribbled notes, their expressions unreadable. But the real turning point came when Aaron added, "This isn't just about me. It's about every patient who has been denied care because of systemic failings. It's about ensuring that no one else has to choose between their safety and their dignity." The room erupted into applause. The sound echoing down the marble halls. The hearing reignited public discourse, sparking debates on news channels, social media, and in living rooms across the country. Aaron's testimony went viral. His words shared millions of times under hashtags like #NotAnotherSecond and #JusticeForAll. Protests grew larger and more organized, with activists demanding concrete action. Cities across the nation held candlelight vigils to honor those whose lives had been lost or irreparably harmed by systemic injustice. For Aaron, the response was both humbling and overwhelming. Strangers approached him on the street, thanking him for his courage. Children wrote him letters, saying they wanted to be doctors, just like Dr. Clark. But amidst the positivity, threats also emerged. Anonymous emails and phone calls warned Aaron to stay quiet, accusing him of betraying law enforcement. One message, in particular, chilled him. "We're watching you. Know your place." Aaron refused to let fear dictate his actions. Instead, he doubled down, speaking at rallies and joining Holt in advocating for the new legislation as the pressure mounted. Officer Willman's composure began to crack. The internal affairs investigation concluded with a recommendation for criminal charges, including obstruction of emergency services and assault. The final blow came when his own precinct announced they would not defend him in court, effectively severing ties. Willman lashed out in a televised interview, blaming everyone from Aaron to the media to the senator. "I'm being sacrificed for political gain," he snarled, his face flushed with anger. "This isn't justice, it's a witch hunt." But his words rang hollow, and public sentiment continued to turn against him. Meanwhile, Holt's proposed bill gained traction in Congress. Lawmakers from both parties acknowledged the urgency of addressing systemic bias, and the legislation moved closer to a vote late one evening. Aaron sat in his office, staring at the framed photo of his father on his desk. The weight of the past weeks had taken its toll, but he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The world was changing, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. His phone buzzed with a message from Holt. "The bill is scheduled for a vote next week. Let's finish this." Aaron smiled faintly, his resolve renewed. He knew the fight wasn't over. But for the first time, he believed they could win. The Capitol building buzzed with anticipation. Lawmakers filled the chamber, their faces a mixture of resolve and tension. Outside, thousands gathered on the steps, their chants echoing through the marble halls. "Not another second." Aaron Clark sat in the gallery, his heart pounding. Beside him was Senator Gerald Holt, his face pale but determined. Weeks of tireless effort had led to this moment, the vote on the Equal Protection and Accountability Act. Holt had crafted the bill with precision, ensuring it addressed systemic racism and abuses of power in law enforcement while bolstering protections for emergency responders. It wasn't perfect, but it was bold, and it was a start. The Speaker of the House called the chamber to order, and the vote began. Aaron gripped the edge of his seat, his breath shallow as the tally appeared on the screen. For every yay, a small ripple of hope surged through the room. For every nay, a collective tension built. Finally, the speaker announced the result. The motion passes. Cheers erupted from the gallery and the crowd outside. Aaron closed his eyes, exhaling deeply. Holt leaned over and whispered, "This is just the beginning." With the bill passed, the focus shifted to Officer Derek Willman's trial. The charges against him included obstruction of emergency services, assault, and misconduct. The trial became a media sensation, drawing national attention as a referendum on systemic abuse within law enforcement. Aaron was called as the star witness. The courtroom was tense as he took the stand. Willman sat at the defense table, his eyes cold and unflinching. His lawyer had built their case around portraying Aaron as overreacting and painting Willman as a victim of public hysteria. Aaron's testimony was precise, recounting the events of that night with unflinching clarity. The patient's life was in immediate danger, Aaron said, his voice steady, Every second counted, but Officer Willman's actions delayed our response. When I explained the urgency, he dismissed me and physically assaulted me. The prosecutor presented the bystander videos as evidence, showing Willman blocking the ambulance and shoving Aaron against the vehicle. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the footage played. Under cross-examination, Willman's lawyer attempted to undermine Aaron's credibility. "Isn't it true that you became confrontational, Dr. Clark?" they asked. Aaron's response was calm. "I became firm because a life was on the line. My responsibility is to my patients, not to appease egos." His words landed like a hammer, resonating with everyone in the courtroom as the trial progressed. The defense struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence. Former colleagues testified about Willman's history of misconduct, describing him as a man prone to overstepping his authority. One officer, speaking under oath, said, "We all knew he had a temper, but no one wanted to cross him. The system protected him." The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning with a verdict: guilty on all counts. Willman showed no emotion as the judge sentenced him to 3 years in prison and stripped him of his pension. But as he was led out of the courtroom, he shot Aaron a glare filled with unrepentant hatred. Aaron met his gaze with quiet resolve, knowing the fight had been worth it. The passage of the Equal Protection and Accountability Act marked a turning point. But its implementation was fraught with challenges. Law enforcement agencies across the country faced pressure to adopt the reforms. But resistance was fierce. Holt and Aaron became unlikely allies in navigating this turbulent phase. Holt used his political influence to hold agencies accountable, while Aaron spoke at conferences and community forums, emphasizing the importance of trust between first responders and the public. One evening, after a particularly grueling town hall, Aaron sat with Holt over coffee. "Do you think it's enough?" Aaron asked. "One bill, one trial, it doesn't erase decades of harm." Holt nodded thoughtfully. "It's not enough, but it's a start. Change doesn't come all at once, Aaron. It comes from people like you, refusing to back down, despite the victories." Aaron couldn't ignore the toll the ordeal had taken on his life. He had become a household name, and while many admired him, others saw him as a polarizing figure. Threatening letters continued to arrive at his home. Once, he returned from work to find graffiti scrawled across his car: "Traitor." Aaron's relationship suffered, too. His girlfriend, Clara, struggled with the constant scrutiny. One evening, as they sat in their apartment, she finally spoke her truth. "I love you, Aaron, but I can't live like this," she said, tears in her eyes. "Everywhere we go, people are staring, judging. I need peace." Aaron felt his chest tighten. He wanted to fight for her, to convince her to stay. But he knew it wouldn't be fair. "I understand," he said quietly, "and I'm sorry." Their breakup left a hollow ache. But Aaron channeled his pain into his work, determined to honor the sacrifices he and others had made. Months passed, and the effects of the new law began to take root. Police departments adopted stricter accountability measures, while emergency responders received additional training on navigating conflicts with law enforcement. In Aaron's city, relationships between the community and first responders began to improve. One day, during a routine hospital shift, Aaron received an unexpected visitor. It was Marcus, the young boy who had once given him a superhero drawing. Now a teenager, Marcus handed Aaron a framed copy of the drawing, updated with bold words written across the top: "Thank you for being brave." Aaron smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You've got a bright future ahead of you, Marcus," he said. "Never stop believing in it." The story culminates in a national summit on racial justice and law enforcement reform, where Aaron and Holt are honored for their contributions. Leaders from across the country gather to discuss the path forward, and Aaron is invited to deliver the keynote address. Standing before a packed auditorium, Aaron reflects on the journey that brought him here. "I never asked to be in this position," he begins. "I never wanted to be a symbol or a spokesperson. But life has a way of choosing us for battles we didn't expect." He pauses, scanning the faces in the audience. This fight isn't over. It won't be over until every life is valued equally. Until every person can walk the streets without fear. And until every doctor can save a life without obstruction. The room erupts into applause. A standing ovation that lasts several minutes. For the first time, Aaron feels a sense of closure, not because the work is done, but because it's finally moving in the right direction months later. Aaron sits on the steps of the hospital, watching the sunset. His life has changed in ways he never imagined, but he has no regrets. A nurse approaches with a clipboard. "Dr. Clark, there's an emergency patient arriving. They need you." Aaron stands, slipping on his white coat. "Let's go." As the ambulance pulls up, Aaron feels a familiar rush of purpose. No cameras, no protests, just the work he was born to do. The fight for justice continues. But for now, Aaron is exactly where he belongs even as the Equal Protection and Accountability Act began its implementation. Opposition forces mobilized to discredit it. A coalition of lawmakers and lobbyists filed lawsuits, arguing the bill was unconstitutional. News channels aired fiery debates, with some commentators framing the law as an attack on law enforcement. Aaron Clark found himself once again in the crosshairs. Pundits dissected his every word from the Senate hearing, questioning his credibility and intentions. Some accused him of using the incident to advance a personal agenda. One night, Aaron turned on the TV to see a panel discussing him. One guest sneered, "Dr. Clark is no hero. He's a political pawn. We don't even know if his version of events is entirely truthful." The words stung, but Aaron refused to let them break him. He knew the truth, and more importantly, so did the countless people who stood behind him. Yet, the attacks wore on him. And for the first time, he wondered if he'd made a mistake stepping into the spotlight while Aaron faced personal attacks. Senator Holt contended with a different kind of resistance. The police union in his home state filed an injunction to halt the bill's implementation, claiming it created an anti-law enforcement bias. Other unions nationwide followed suit, threatening to strike if their demands weren't met. The situation escalated when officers in a major city staged a sick-out, leaving neighborhoods without adequate policing. Holt's office was flooded with calls from constituents, some accusing him of putting their safety at risk. Holt remained steadfast. "This isn't about punishing good officers," he said during a press conference. "It's about ensuring accountability for those who abuse their power." The pressure, however, was mounting. Late one night, Aaron received a call from Holt. "We need a win," Holt said, his voice weary. "A visible, undeniable win to show people why this bill matters." Aaron knew what Holt meant. They needed a symbol, someone whose story could counter the fearmongering and remind the public of the stakes. Aaron's story. Aaron reluctantly agreed to appear at a high-profile televised town hall alongside Holt. The event was billed as a chance for the public to ask questions about the bill and hear directly from its champions. The auditorium was packed, and the energy crackled with tension. Supporters of the bill cheered as Aaron and Holt took the stage, while detractors jeered from the back rows. The moderator began with questions about the bill, allowing Holt to detail its provisions. But soon, the focus shifted to Aaron. "Dr. Clark," the moderator said, "some have accused you of exaggerating your encounter with Officer Willman. How do you respond to claims that you're leveraging this incident for personal gain?" The question hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Aaron took a deep breath before responding. "I became a doctor to save lives," he began, his voice steady. "That night, my only concern was the patient in the ambulance. What happened wasn't about me, it was about a system that allowed prejudice to delay life-saving care." He paused, meeting the audience's gaze. "I didn't choose this fight. It chose me, and if standing here means no one else has to experience what I did, then it's worth it." The room fell silent for a moment, then erupted into applause. Even some skeptics in the back rows seemed moved. The town hall marked a turning point. Videos of Aaron's speech spread like wildfire, reigniting public support for the bill. Communities across the country began hosting their own discussions on systemic reform, inspired by Aaron's resilience. One such community was a small town in the Midwest, where a group of paramedics organized a workshop on bias in emergency response. One of them, a young black woman named Rachel, credited Aaron's story for giving her the courage to speak out about the discrimination she'd faced. Aaron received an email from Rachel, thanking him. "You showed me that we can make a difference, even when it feels impossible," she wrote. Her words gave Aaron strength. For every attack he faced, there were people like Rachel, people who were stepping up to change the system from within. From prison, Derek Willman filed an appeal, claiming his conviction was politically motivated. His legal team argued that the media frenzy surrounding his case had tainted the jury, and they demanded a retrial. The appeal sparked a wave of controversy, with some media outlets amplifying Willman's claims. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, their signs reflecting the divide: justice for Willman, on one side; no second chances for corruption, on the other. Aaron was called to testify again during the appeal hearings. This time, he faced an even more aggressive line of questioning from Willman's new defense attorney. "You claim Officer Willman obstructed your ability to provide care," the attorney said, pacing before the jury. "But isn't it true that the patient survived, proving that the delay didn't ultimately affect the outcome?" Aaron's jaw tightened. "The patient survived because of the actions we took after the delay. Every second matters in an emergency. That delay could have cost a life." The attorney smirked. "But it didn't." Aaron leaned forward, his voice unwavering. "This isn't about what could have happened to one patient. It's about what has happened to countless others because of similar delays. Because of a system that fails to prioritize human life over prejudice." The courtroom was silent. Even the defense attorney seemed momentarily at a loss for words. The appeal was denied, and Willman remained in prison. The decision sparked renewed conversations about systemic accountability, not just in law enforcement but across all institutions. Aaron became a sought-after speaker, traveling the country to share his story. He met with first responders, police officers, and community leaders, emphasizing the need for empathy and mutual respect. At one event, a young police officer approached him. "Dr. Clark," she said, "I joined the force to help people. But stories like yours make me question if I'm part of the problem. How can I be part of the solution?" Aaron smiled gently. "The fact that you're asking that question means you already are." Months later, Aaron returned to his hospital for a quiet shift. The spotlight had dimmed somewhat, but his resolve remained. As he walked the halls, he reflected on how far they'd come, and how much work remained. That evening, a patient's family stopped him in the corridor. The mother clutched his hand, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Dr. Clark," she said, "not just for what you did for Senator Holt, but for what you've done for all of us." Aaron felt a lump in his throat. "I just did what I could," he said softly. As he watched the family walk away, Aaron realized something profound. The fight for justice wasn't just about laws or headlines. It was about moments like this, moments where compassion and courage could change lives. In the final chapter, Aaron and Senator Holt attend a ceremony celebrating the full implementation of the Equal Protection and Accountability Act. The event is attended by lawmakers, activists, and community members from across the nation. As Aaron takes the stage to speak, he looks out at the crowd and feels a sense of peace. The journey had been grueling, but it had been worth it. "This isn't the end," he says. "It's the beginning, a beginning that belongs to all of us. Together, we can build a future where justice and dignity are not ideals but realities." The crowd erupts into applause, their voices rising in unity. For Aaron, it is a moment of closure and a promise to continue the work.